In the era of advanced surveillance and forest monitoring systems, there exist recordings so disturbing that federal agencies have locked them away in classified vaults. These are not blurry photos. These are crystal-clear videos that capture something so impossible, so terrifying, that even the most hardened cryptozoologists refuse to acknowledge their existence publicly. Today, we will examine the most disturbing Bigfoot footage ever recorded, evidence that reveals a truth too frightening for the world to accept, that we are being watched from the shadows of our deepest forests, and whatever is observing us possesses an intelligence and malevolence far beyond anything we ever imagined. On October 22, 2023, 43-year-old David Kellerman, a former military intelligence officer turned private investigator, stumbled upon what would become the most controversial piece of evidence in cryptozoology history. What started as a routine surveillance job in the remote forests of Northern California would lead to the discovery of footage so compelling and disturbing that government agencies would spend months trying to suppress its release. David Kellerman had built his reputation on finding things that others couldn't or wouldn't. After 15 years in military intelligence, specializing in reconnaissance and surveillance operations, he had transitioned to private investigation work that often took him to places most people would never dare to venture. During his service, David had developed skills that few civilians possessed. He could move through any terrain without leaving traces, set up surveillance equipment that would remain undetected for months, and analyze behavioral patterns with an accuracy that had made him legendary among his peers. The case that brought David to the Humboldt County wilderness seemed straightforward enough. Margaret Thornfield, an elderly widow from San Francisco, had hired him to investigate the disappearance of her grandson, 22-year-old Timothy Thornfield, who had vanished during a solo camping trip 6 months earlier. The official search had been called off after 3 weeks, with authorities concluding that Timothy had likely fallen victim to harsh wilderness conditions. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with the official explanation. Timothy had been an experienced outdoorsman and Eagle Scout who knew the forests of Northern California better than most park rangers. She was convinced that something else had happened to her grandson. The official investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Search and rescue teams had combed hundreds of square miles of forest using helicopters, tracking dogs, and thermal imaging equipment. They had found Timothy's abandoned campsite relatively quickly, but the scene had raised more questions than answers. His tent was still standing, his food supplies were untouched, and his expensive camera equipment was scattered around the site as if he had left in a hurry. David's investigation had led him deep into the Six Rivers National Forest, following Timothy's planned route through some of the most remote terrain in California. His methodical approach had already uncovered several clues that suggested Timothy's disappearance was far from ordinary. Strange footprints around the abandoned campsite, unusual hair samples caught on tree branches, and several damaged trees that showed signs of being deliberately broken. The footprints were unlike anything David had encountered. They measured approximately 16 inches in length and 8 inches in width, with a depth that suggested something weighing at least 400 pounds. The stride pattern indicated bipedal movement, but the gait was different from human locomotion. It was on his 4th day in the forest that David made the discovery that would change everything. While investigating a remote valley about 2 miles from Timothy's last known location, David's motion-activated trail cameras had captured something extraordinary during the previous night. The footage showed a massive, bipedal creature moving through the forest with purposeful intelligence, carrying what appeared to be human belongings. David's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but reviewing the footage on his camera's LCD screen made his hands shake with excitement and disbelief. The creature was unlike anything he had seen in his years of wilderness operations around the world. Standing at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, coarse hair, it moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The creature's movement patterns were particularly fascinating to David's trained eye. It demonstrated an understanding of forest navigation that surpassed even the most experienced human woodsman. The being moved along natural corridors through the dense vegetation, avoiding areas where its passage would leave obvious signs, and seemed to understand how to use terrain features to remain concealed from potential observers. More disturbing was what the creature was carrying. David could clearly make out a backpack, camping gear, and what looked like camera equipment, items that matched the description of Timothy Thornfield's missing belongings. The implications were staggering. Not only had David potentially captured the first clear footage of a Bigfoot, but the creature appeared to be connected to Timothy's disappearance. David's investigation took on new urgency as he realized he might be dealing with something far more significant than a simple missing person case. He began setting up additional cameras throughout the valley, creating a surveillance network that would monitor the creature's movements and hopefully lead him to answers about Timothy's fate. The surveillance network David established was based on techniques he had learned during counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. He positioned cameras at natural choke points where any large creature would be forced to pass, used camouflaged solar panels to ensure continuous power, and established overlapping fields of view that would make it impossible for anything to move through the area undetected. The breakthrough came on his 6th night in the forest. David's cameras captured not just one creature, but an entire family group, adults and what appeared to be juveniles, moving through the valley in a coordinated pattern. The footage revealed behavior that was unmistakably intelligent. The creatures communicated through complex vocalizations, used tools to manipulate their environment, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that challenged everything science thought it knew about unknown primates. The family group consisted of what appeared to be 2 adult males, 3 adult females, and 4 juveniles of varying ages. Their social interactions were remarkably sophisticated, with clear hierarchies and role assignments. The larger male seemed to serve as a scout, moving ahead of the group to assess potential threats or obstacles. The females appeared to be responsible for the care and education of the juveniles, while the second male brought up the rear, ensuring the group's security. Most remarkably, the cameras captured the creatures interacting with human artifacts in ways that suggested they understood their purpose and origin. They examined Timothy's camping equipment with obvious curiosity, handled his camera gear with surprising gentleness, and even appeared to be attempting to operate some of the electronic devices. David realized he was documenting something unprecedented. Not just evidence of Bigfoot's existence, but proof that these creatures possessed intelligence and curiosity about human technology. The footage showed them living in sophisticated shelters constructed from natural materials, using primitive tools, and maintaining what appeared to be a complex social structure. The shelters were particularly impressive, demonstrating engineering principles that rivaled human construction techniques. The creatures had woven branches and vegetation into waterproof structures that provided protection from the elements while remaining virtually invisible to casual observation. The interiors were organized with designated areas for sleeping, food storage, and what appeared to be tool-making activities. But the most shocking discovery came when David's cameras captured footage of Timothy Thornfield himself, alive, apparently unharmed, and living among the creatures. The young man appeared to have been adopted into their group, participating in their daily activities and showing no signs of distress or captivity. The footage suggested that rather than being a victim, Timothy had become an observer and perhaps even a student of these remarkable beings. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Timothy appeared to have been living with the creatures for months, learning their behaviors and possibly even their communication methods. In several clips, David observed Timothy participating in what appeared to be teaching sessions where the adult creatures demonstrated various survival techniques and forest navigation skills. The young man seemed to have adapted remarkably well to his new environment, showing none of the psychological trauma typically associated with prolonged captivity or isolation. Timothy's integration into the group was so complete that he had begun to adopt some of their behavioral patterns. he moved through the forest with the same silent grace as his adoptive family, communicated through a combination of gestures and vocalizations that the creatures seemed to understand, and participated in their daily routines of foraging, shelter maintenance, and group activities. David's analysis of the footage revealed even more disturbing details. The creatures appeared to have a sophisticated understanding of human technology and behavior. They had carefully preserved Timothy's electronic equipment, keeping it dry and protected in what appeared to be a specially constructed shelter. More remarkably, they seemed to understand the purpose of the cameras and recording devices, occasionally positioning them to capture specific activities or interactions. The social dynamics within the creature group were complex and fascinating. David observed clear hierarchies, with older individuals teaching younger ones and specific roles assigned to different members of the community. They demonstrated advanced problem-solving abilities, working together to construct elaborate shelters, create tools from natural materials, and even develop what appeared to be a primitive form of agriculture, cultivating certain plants and fungi in designated areas of their territory. The creatures' tool use was particularly sophisticated. They fashioned implements from stone, wood, and bone that served specific purposes. Digging tools for extracting roots and tubers, cutting implements for processing plant materials, and even what appeared to be primitive weapons for hunting small game. The tools showed evidence of careful craftsmanship and were maintained and improved over time. David's military instincts told him that this discovery was too significant to handle alone. The footage he had captured would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution, primate intelligence, and the hidden ecosystems that still existed in North America's most remote wilderness areas. But he also understood that such evidence would attract attention from government agencies that might not have the public's best interests at heart. His concerns proved justified when David returned to civilization and attempted to contact Timothy's grandmother with news of his discovery. Within hours of uploading the footage to a secure server, David found himself under surveillance by unmarked vehicles and receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent various federal agencies but carried credentials that didn't quite check out. The first visit came at 6:30 a.m., just 2 days after David had returned from the forest. 3 individuals in dark suits appeared at his office, claiming to represent a joint task force investigating unusual wildlife activity in national forests. Their leader, who identified himself only as Agent Morrison, was polite but firm in his questioning about David's activities in the 6 Rivers National Forest. The visitors were professional and polite, but their message was clear. David had stumbled upon something that was considered a matter of national security. They explained that the existence of these creatures had been known to certain government agencies for decades, and that a careful protocol had been established to manage any interactions or discoveries. David's footage, they claimed, could disrupt delicate research programs and potentially endanger both the creatures and any humans who might encounter them. Agent Morrison revealed that the government had been aware of these creature populations since the 1960s. When military personnel conducting training exercises in remote wilderness areas began reporting encounters with unknown bipedal primates. Initial investigations had been conducted under the auspices of various classified programs, with findings that were deemed too sensitive for public release. The pressure to surrender his evidence intensified rapidly. David received offers to purchase his footage for substantial sums, followed by increasingly aggressive demands that he turn over all materials related to his investigation. When he refused, the harassment escalated to include break-ins at his office, tampering with his vehicle, and threats against his personal safety. The offers were substantial, initially starting at $500,000 for all footage and related materials, then escalating to over $2 million when David continued to refuse. The money was offered through intermediaries who claimed to represent private research foundations, but David's intelligence background allowed him to recognize the hallmarks of government-front organizations. David realized he was caught in a situation that went far beyond a simple missing person case. The government's reaction to his discovery suggested that authorities were already aware of these creatures' existence and were actively working to suppress any evidence that might reach the public. The implications were staggering. If Bigfoot was real and the government knew about it, how many other secrets were being kept from the American people? The harassment campaign against David was sophisticated and relentless. His phone calls were monitored, his internet activity was tracked, and his financial accounts were subjected to mysterious audits and freezes. Former military colleagues who had maintained contact with him suddenly became unavailable, and his professional network began to distance themselves from his work. The message was clear: cooperate with the suppression effort or face complete professional and personal destruction. David's bank accounts were frozen under the pretense of a tax investigation. His professional licenses were challenged by regulatory agencies, citing anonymous complaints. And his landlord received visits from individuals claiming to be conducting background checks for security clearances. The psychological pressure was intense and unrelenting, designed to isolate him from support systems and make resistance seem futile. But David's military training had prepared him for psychological warfare, and he refused to be intimidated. Instead, he began documenting the harassment he was experiencing, creating a parallel record of government suppression that was almost as compelling as his original Bigfoot footage. The pattern of intimidation and cover-up suggested that these creatures represented something far more significant than just an unknown species. They were evidence of a hidden world that powerful interests were determined to keep secret. Using skills learned during his military career, David began taking precautions to protect both himself and his evidence. He created multiple copies of his footage, stored them in secure locations, and established protocols for their release if anything happened to him. He also reached out to trusted contacts in the scientific community, sharing his findings with researchers who had the expertise to understand their significance. David's security protocols were based on techniques used to protect classified intelligence in hostile environments. He established dead drops in multiple locations, created encrypted digital copies stored on secure servers in different countries, and developed a network of trusted individuals who would release the information if he disappeared or was incapacitated. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a primatologist at UC Berkeley who had been quietly studying Bigfoot reports for over a decade, was among the first scientists to review David's footage. Her analysis confirmed what David had suspected. The creatures displayed behavioral patterns and physical characteristics that were consistent with a highly intelligent primate species that had somehow remained hidden from mainstream science. Dr. Rodriguez had been conducting her research in secret, knowing that open investigation of Bigfoot phenomena would destroy her academic career. She had accumulated a database of over 3,000 reported encounters, analyzed hundreds of footprint casts, and even collected hair and tissue samples that defied classification. David's footage provided the visual confirmation she had been seeking for years. The genetic analysis of hair samples that David had collected provided even more compelling evidence. The DNA showed characteristics that were clearly primate, but didn't match any known species in scientific databases. Most intriguingly, the genetic markers suggested a lineage that had diverged from human ancestors much more recently than previously thought possible. The DNA analysis revealed a genetic profile that was approximately 96% similar to modern humans, closer than chimpanzees or any other known primate species. The remaining 4% showed unique characteristics that suggested adaptation to specific environmental conditions and possibly enhanced physical capabilities. The genetic evidence supported the theory that these creatures represented a surviving branch of the human family tree. Dr. Rodriguez's preliminary findings indicated that these creatures might represent a surviving population of an archaic hominid species, possibly related to Homo erectus or an unknown branch of the human family tree. The implications for our understanding of human evolution were profound. If these beings had survived in North America for thousands of years, it would completely rewrite the story of human migration and development. The scientific analysis also revealed disturbing evidence of government knowledge and involvement. Several of the hair samples contained traces of synthetic compounds that suggested the creatures had been exposed to human-made chemicals, possibly through deliberate feeding or medical treatment. This evidence supported David's growing suspicion that government agencies had been studying and possibly managing these populations for decades. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of compounds used in veterinary tranquilizers, suggesting that the creatures had been captured and studied at some point. There were also traces of synthetic vitamins and minerals that indicated supplemental feeding programs. The evidence painted a picture of long-term government monitoring and management of these populations. As word of David's discovery began to spread through underground networks of researchers and cryptozoology enthusiasts, the pressure from government agencies intensified. David found himself the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to discredit his findings and destroy his reputation. False stories about his military service appeared online, his professional licenses were challenged by regulatory agencies, and former clients were contacted and pressured to file complaints against him. The disinformation campaign was remarkably thorough and well coordinated. Fake social media accounts began spreading rumors about David's mental health and professional competence. Doctored documents appeared online, suggesting he had been discharged from the military under questionable circumstances. Even his family members were contacted by individuals claiming to be journalists or researchers, asking leading questions designed to elicit statements that could be used to undermine his credibility. Professional trolls flooded online forums with posts questioning David's military record, his investigative methods, and his mental stability. Fake reviews appeared on professional rating sites, describing fictional negative experiences with his services. The campaign was so sophisticated that it clearly required significant resources and coordination, further confirming David's suspicions about government involvement. The situation reached a crisis point when David received credible intelligence that a raid on his secure storage facilities was being planned. Realizing that his evidence was in immediate danger, he made the decision to release everything to the public through multiple channels simultaneously. The footage was uploaded to dozens of video platforms, sent to news organizations around the world, and distributed through encrypted networks that would make it impossible to suppress completely. David's release strategy was carefully planned and executed with military precision. He coordinated the simultaneous release across multiple time zones, ensuring that the footage would be available on dozens of platforms before authorities could react. He also included detailed documentation of the harassment campaign against him, creating a narrative that explained why the evidence was being suppressed. The public release of David's footage created an immediate sensation. Within hours, the videos had been viewed millions of times and were being analyzed by experts around the world. The quality and consistency of the evidence made it impossible to dismiss as a hoax, and the documentation of government suppression efforts added credibility to claims that authorities had been hiding the truth about Bigfoot for decades. The initial response was overwhelming. Major news networks picked up the story within hours, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions, analyses, and debates about the footage. The hashtag Bigfoot Revealed began trending worldwide, and the videos were shared millions of times across all platforms. The scientific community's response was divided but intense. Mainstream researchers who had previously dismissed Bigfoot as pseudoscience were forced to confront evidence that met rigorous standards of documentation and analysis. The footage showed anatomical details, behavioral patterns, and environmental interactions that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. Leading primatologists from around the world began requesting access to the raw footage for analysis. Dr. Jane Goodall, the renowned chimpanzee researcher, issued a statement calling for serious scientific investigation of the evidence. The International Union for Conservation of Nature announced the formation of a special committee to evaluate the footage and its implications for primate taxonomy. Most compelling was the documentation of Timothy Thornfield's apparent integration into the creature's social group. Anthropologists noted that his behavior in the footage suggested he had learned to communicate with the beings and had been accepted as a member of their community. The implications for our understanding of interspecies communication and intelligence were profound. The international response to David's revelations was swift and varied. European scientists, less constrained by American government pressure, began organizing expeditions to search for similar creatures in their own wilderness areas. Indigenous communities around the world came forward with their own stories and evidence of encounters with similar beings, suggesting that these creatures might represent a global phenomenon rather than a uniquely North American mystery. The Smithsonian Institution announced plans for a comprehensive analysis of the footage, while the National Geographic Society committed funding for follow-up expeditions to the area where David had made his discoveries. International research teams from Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom requested permission to conduct their own investigations in American wilderness areas. The government's response to the footage's release was swift and predictable. Official statements dismissed the evidence as elaborate hoaxes, while behind the scenes, agencies worked to discredit David and suppress further investigation. The area where he had made his discoveries was suddenly declared off-limits due to environmental concerns, and researchers who attempted to verify his findings were turned away by armed guards. The Forest Service issued emergency closure orders for large sections of the Six Rivers National Forest, citing concerns about endangered species habitat and fire danger. Military personnel were deployed to enforce the closures, and aircraft were prohibited from flying over the restricted areas. The response was so disproportionate that it only served to validate David's claims about government cover-up efforts. But the damage to the cover-up had already been done. David's footage had provided the world with undeniable evidence that intelligent bipedal creatures were living in North America's wilderness areas, and that government agencies had been aware of their existence for years. The revelation sparked a global conversation about what other secrets might be hidden from public view, and whether citizens had the right to know about discoveries that could fundamentally change our understanding of life on Earth. Timothy Thornfield's fate remained a mystery, as attempts to return to the area where he had been filmed were blocked by federal authorities. His grandmother, Margaret, filed lawsuits demanding access to her grandson and answers about his condition, but legal proceedings were stalled by claims of national security and public safety concerns. The legal battle that followed revealed the extent of government knowledge about these creatures. Court documents, heavily redacted but still revealing, showed that multiple agencies had been aware of Bigfoot populations for decades. Research programs funded through black budgets and classified operations had been studying the creature's behavior, intelligence, and potential impact on human society. Margaret Thornfield's legal team, led by prominent civil rights attorney Sarah Chen, filed Freedom of Information Act requests that uncovered decades of classified documents related to anomalous primate encounters in national forests. The documents revealed a systematic program of evidence suppression and witness intimidation that had been ongoing since the 1960s. The classified documents revealed the existence of a joint military-civilian research program codenamed Project Wildman that had been studying these creatures for over 50 years. The program had documented hundreds of encounters, collected extensive biological samples, and even attempted limited communication with the beings. The research had been classified at the highest levels due to concerns about public panic and the potential impact on religious and scientific worldviews. David's life was forever changed by his discovery and the events that followed. He became a reluctant celebrity in the cryptozoology community while remaining a target of government harassment and surveillance. His private investigation business was destroyed by the controversy, but he found new purpose as an advocate for government transparency and the public's right to know about scientific discoveries. The harassment continued even after the footage's release, with David facing ongoing legal challenges, financial difficulties, and personal threats. However, He also received support from unexpected quarters, including former government officials who came forward to confirm the existence of classified programs studying these creatures. The footage that David captured in the forests of Northern California remains some of the most compelling evidence for Bigfoot's existence ever recorded. More importantly, it has opened a window into a hidden world that exists parallel to our own, challenging our assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's place in the natural order. The creatures that David documented continue to live in the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest, protected now not just by their own intelligence and stealth, but by government agencies that seem determined to keep their existence secret. The reasons for this secrecy remain unclear, but the implications are profound. If such remarkable beings can remain hidden in our modern world, what other wonders and mysteries await discovery in the wild places that still exist beyond the reach of civilization? On March 17, 2025, Brian thought he filmed a bear, but instead captured the most terrifying creature on planet Earth. The disgustingly large Sasquatch didn't hesitate and went after him, and what investigators later discovered about his sighting turned this story into the darkest Bigfoot encounter ever seen. When Brian Phillips parked at the Farley's Prairie Trailhead in Ocala National Forest around 2 p.m., planning a simple 4-mile loop through the pine flatwoods. The temperature sat at 73 degrees, and the forest was unusually quiet. He had covered roughly a mile and a half when he noticed something moving through the palmetto scrub approximately 200 feet ahead. His first assumption was a black bear, common in this part of the forest. Black bears were frequently sighted in Ocala National Forest, especially during spring when they emerged from their winter dens. He stopped walking and reached for his phone, more out of excitement than concern. The figure moved between two longleaf pines, and Brian activated his camera. Through the screen, he watched as the shape emerged into a small clearing. It was walking upright. The stride was too long, the proportions completely wrong for a human. The shoulders were massive, easily 3 feet across. Brian estimated the height at around 7.5 feet, though the uneven terrain made precision difficult. Dark brown hair covered the entire body, matted and thick. It moved with purpose, not the shambling gait of a bear on its hind legs. Bears could walk upright for short distances, but their movement was clumsy, unstable. This was different. Each step looked natural, balanced, as if walking on 2 legs was its primary mode of movement. Brian kept the phone steady, trying to capture as much detail as possible. The creature moved through dappled sunlight, filtering through the pine canopy. In the brighter patches, the hair appeared lighter, almost reddish-brown. In the shadows, it looked nearly black. The head sat directly on the shoulders with almost no visible neck. When the creature turned slightly, Brian could see the profile. The forehead sloped back sharply from the pronounced brow. The jaw jutted forward. It was not a bear. It was not a person. Brian's recording shows 47 seconds of this initial sighting. The creature moved from left to right across the clearing, never looking in his direction. Its arms swung naturally at its sides, longer than human arms, reaching past where the knees would be. The legs were thick and powerful, each step covering nearly 4 feet of ground. When it reached the far tree line, it paused. The head turned slightly, profile visible for just 3 seconds. The face showed a pronounced brow ridge and a flat nose. Then it disappeared into the dense understory. Every instinct told Brian to return to his vehicle. The parking area was less than 2 miles back. He could be there in 30 minutes at a quick pace. Instead, he moved forward. He would later tell investigators that something compelled him to follow, a curiosity that overrode his fear. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Whatever he had just seen, it was real, and it was in front of him. He stayed on the trail for another 100 feet, then stepped off into the palmetto. The creature had left disturbed vegetation, bent fronds showing the direction of travel. The path was unmistakable. Something large had pushed through here, and recently. Brian kept his phone raised, recording continuously now. The footage shows his hands shaking, the image bouncing with each step. The palmetto grew thicker off-trail, the stiff fronds reaching waist-high. They scraped against his pants and grabbed at his boots. Progress was slow. He had to push through with his free hand while keeping the camera up with his right. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the moderate temperature. The exertion combined with adrenaline made his breathing heavier. He tracked the disturbances for roughly 300 feet, moving deeper into an area where the pines grew denser and the understory thickened with saw palmetto and gallberry. The canopy blocked much of the afternoon sun. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. The temperature felt cooler here, away from direct sunlight. His video timestamp showed 2:17 p.m. when he stopped again. Something had changed in the forest. The usual sounds, the distant birds and rustling of small animals, had ceased completely. Brian panned his camera slowly from left to right. The recording captured his breathing, faster now, and the crunch of dry pine needles under his boots. He stood completely still, listening. Nothing. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Movement flickered in his peripheral vision. He spun left, camera following. The creature stood 80 feet away, partially obscured by a dead pine. But it was facing him now. The footage shows a clear frontal view for nearly 8 seconds. The body was broader than any human, the chest barrel-shaped and covered in dark hair that appeared lighter around the face. The arms hung at its sides, hands visible, each finger clearly defined. The hands looked almost human in structure, but larger, much larger. Each hand appeared to be at least 12 inches long. The face stared directly at the camera. The eyes were dark, sunken beneath that heavy brow ridge. Brian froze. The creature did not move. It simply watched him, standing perfectly still in a way that felt deliberate, patient. Then it stepped out from behind the tree. The full height became apparent. Brian's angle, shooting slightly upward, confirmed this thing stood well over 7 feet tall. The legs were thick, powerful, built for strength rather than speed. Or so Brian thought. It took 2 steps forward, closing the distance to about 70 feet. Each step was measured, controlled. Brian's camera lowered slightly, his arm wavering. The footage becomes less steady. His hands were shaking more now. The creature took another step. Brian backed up. His boot caught on something, a root or vine hidden under the pine needles, and the camera jerked as he caught himself. He stumbled but did not fall. When he raised the phone again, the creature had moved. It was now 50 feet away. It had covered 20 feet in the second or two when Brian's camera was down. The speed was wrong. Something that large should not be able to move that quickly, that quietly. The recording shows Brian turning and walking quickly back the way he came. He kept the camera pointed behind him, over his shoulder. The creature followed. It matched his pace, maintaining the 50-foot distance. The spacing felt intentional, not close enough to be an immediate threat, but close enough to maintain pressure. Brian increased his speed. The creature did the same. Its movements remained smooth, efficient. The footage captured nearly 2 minutes of this pursuit. The creature never closed the gap further, but it never fell behind. It walked with the same steady, powerful stride. Its head remained fixed on Brian, tracking his movement through the forest. The eyes never left him. Brian glanced forward to navigate, then back to check the creature's position. Each time he looked back, it was still there, still maintaining that exact distance. The precision felt wrong. Animals did not behave this way. They either attacked or they fled. This was something else entirely. Brian reached the area where he first left the trail. He scrambled up onto the path, nearly dropping his phone. The footage shows dirt and vegetation, then the trail ahead as he turned to run. He looked back one more time. The creature stood at the edge of the trail, 40 feet away now. It had stopped moving. Brian ran. The recording went dark as he shoved the phone in his pocket, but the audio continued. His breathing came in gasps, his footsteps pounding on the hard-packed sand trail. The audio captured something else. A sound that started low, almost a rumble, then rose in pitch. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, unlike anything in the Florida wilderness. Not a bear, not a panther, not any known animal. The vocalization seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing through the pines. Brian's running footsteps stuttered, slowed. The camera came back out of his pocket. The footage shows the trail ahead, empty. Brian turned in a full circle, nothing visible in any direction. He moved forward again, no longer running but walking fast. His breathing had settled slightly. The trail curved ahead, returning toward the prairie. Brian checked behind him every few seconds. The forest remained empty, but something felt wrong. He later described it as a pressure, a sense of being watched from all sides. The footage shows him scanning the tree line continuously. At 2:31 p.m., roughly 14 minutes after the initial sighting, he was approximately half a mile from his vehicle. A crack echoed through the forest. The sound was sharp, loud like a gunshot. Brian spun toward the sound. His camera captured a pine branch, easily 6 inches in diameter, falling to the trail 30 feet ahead. It hit the ground with a heavy thud that sent up dust. The branch had broken cleanly, snapped near the trunk. There was no wind. The air was still. Pine branches did not simply break on their own. Brian approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant. The footage shows him looking up into the canopy. The tree where the branch had broken stood at least 40 feet tall. Nothing visible in the upper branches. No movement. He stepped around the branch and continued. His pace had slowed considerably now. He checked the forest on both sides constantly. 20 feet later, another crack. This time from the right side of the trail. Another branch, this one even larger, perhaps 8 inches across. It crashed through the understory, breaking smaller branches on its way down. It landed 15 feet from where Brian stood. The impact shook the ground slightly. Brian could feel it through his boots. He stopped walking completely. His breathing was audible on the recording now, coming in short, quick bursts. He raised his camera, filming the forest on both sides. The footage shows dense vegetation, shadows between the trees. The palmetto was too thick to see more than 20 feet in most directions. He called out, asking if anyone was there. His voice carried through the quiet forest, sounding small and uncertain. No response came, not a sound. He waited for perhaps 15 seconds, the camera still rolling. Nothing. He started moving again, faster now. His walk was almost a jog. The trail straightened ahead, offering a clear view for perhaps 100 feet. Brian focused on that distant section, on reaching open ground. If he could get back to the prairie, to the trailhead, he would be safe. The parking area felt impossibly far away now, though it was less than half a mile. The third branch came from directly overhead. The crack was louder, sharper. It sounded closer. Brian looked up just as it fell. The footage captured his dive to the side, the camera swinging wildly. Sky, trees, ground, all blurred together. He hit the ground hard, landing on his left side. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. The phone flew from his hand, tumbling through the air. It landed in the palmetto, camera facing the trail. The branch, nearly 8 feet long and as thick as a man's thigh, slammed into the trail where he had been standing. The impact sent up a cloud of dust and pine needles. If Brian had not moved, if he had been even a second slower, the branch would have struck him directly. The phone landed in the palmetto, camera facing the trail. The angle showed Brian on his hands and knees, scrambling to his feet. He looked up into the canopy, then all around. His mouth moved, words inaudible on the recording. He stepped toward where the phone lay, reaching down. Before he could grab it, a rock struck the ground 3 feet from the phone. The rock hit with force, embedding itself slightly in the soft sand. Then another, landing between Brian and the device. The rocks were substantial, each the size of a softball. They came from the right side of the trail. Brian jerked back, stumbling. A third rock hit closer to the phone, then a fourth. They formed a pattern, a line across the trail. Brian changed direction, moving left, circling to reach his phone from a different angle. More rocks pelted the trail, 5 more in rapid succession. They fell with precision, each one landing exactly where Brian was trying to move. They formed a line, as if thrown deliberately to block his path. The spacing was too exact to be random. Brian stopped. He stared in the direction the rocks were coming from. The footage, from its position in the undergrowth, captured his profile. His body language showed tension, hands raised slightly in front of him. Defensive, he took a step back, then another. His head turned slowly, scanning the tree line, looking for the source. Something massive moved through the palmetto on the right side of the trail. The vegetation shook violently, fronds bending and breaking. Something large was pushing through, and it was not being careful about stealth anymore. The sound grew louder, closer. Brian turned to run. The footage captured his legs as he passed the phone, sprinting down the trail. His boots kicked up sand with each stride. The sounds of breaking vegetation grew louder. Whatever was in the forest was moving fast, parallel to the trail. The palmetto rattled and shook along a 30-foot section. Brian's footsteps faded slightly as he got further from the phone. His breathing was ragged, panicked. The sound of breaking branches continued, getting closer to the camera's position. The entire understory seemed to be moving. Then it appeared. The creature stepped out of the palmetto 20 feet from where the phone lay. The angle captured it from roughly waist height. The massive legs, trunk-like and covered in dark hair. Each leg was thicker than any human thigh, the muscles visible even through the hair as it moved. The arms hanging forward slightly, the hands flexed, fingers spreading and closing. It turned its head, looking down the trail in the direction Brian had gone. The face was fully visible for nearly 4 seconds, heavy brow ridge casting shadows over the eyes, deep-set eyes that reflected light slightly, giving them an almost luminous quality. Flat nose with large nostrils that flared as it breathed. The mouth was closed, the jaw prominent and strong. Hair covered most of the face, but thinned around the eyes and mouth, revealing dark skin underneath. The expression was not aggressive, but focused, intelligent. The eyes showed awareness, calculation. The creature took 3 steps onto the trail, each footfall visible in the frame. The feet were enormous, easily 18 inches long, wider than a human foot. The toes splayed out with each step, gripping the sand. 5 toes were clearly visible on the left foot as it lifted. The foot flexed naturally, the arch visible. These were not bear paws, not costume pieces. The movement was too natural, too complex. The creature paused in the middle of the trail, turned its head back toward the camera for just a moment. The eyes seemed to look directly at the lens. Then it looked down the trail again, toward where Brian had disappeared. It dropped into a forward stance, weight shifting onto the balls of its feet. The knees bent slightly. The arms came up, hands positioned forward. Then it ran. The speed was shocking. The creature covered ground faster than seemed possible for something so large. Its gait was not quite human, the stride too long, each step covering nearly 6 feet. The arm swing was too pronounced, the arms pumping with tremendous force. But it was clearly bipedal running, not the quadrupedal gallop of a bear. The power in each stride was visible in how its feet struck the ground, sending up small clouds of sand. Within 3 seconds, it had disappeared around the curve in the trail. The sound of its footfalls continued for several seconds more, heavy thuds that faded into the distance. The forest fell silent again. The phone continued recording from its position in the palmetto, showing only the empty trail and the rocks scattered across the sand. Small clouds of dust still hung in the air where the creature had run. 43 seconds later, a scream cut through the forest. It was human, Brian's voice coming from perhaps 200 feet away. The scream was raw, primal, filled with terror and pain. It lasted 2 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Impact sounds followed, something heavy hitting the ground. A grunt, distinctly human. More sounds of struggle, breaking vegetation, thrashing, then silence again. Complete silence. The phone recorded nothing but that silence for nearly 30 seconds. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The forest held its breath. Movement appeared at the edge of the frame. Brian came into view, crawling on the trail. He was bleeding from his forehead, blood running down the left side of his face. The cut was deep, possibly from hitting the ground or a rock. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, the fabric hanging loose. Scratches covered his exposed shoulder, some deep enough to bleed. He crawled toward the phone, each movement showing pain. His left arm dragged slightly, not moving correctly. The shoulder hung at an odd angle, dislocated. He reached the phone, grabbed it with his right hand. His fingers were shaking, barely able to grip. The camera swung up, showing his face for just a moment. The blood, the wide eyes, the dirt caked on his right cheek. His mouth was open, breathing hard. Then the footage went dark as he pulled the phone close to his chest, curling around it protectively. The audio continued. Brian's breathing was ragged, gasping. Each breath sounded painful, catching in his throat. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Not running now. Walking. Slow. Each footfall was distinct, spaced several feet apart. They stopped close, very close, perhaps 3 feet from where Brian lay. A new sound emerged, a breathing that was not Brian's. Deeper, slower, resonating. It came from directly above the microphone. Something was standing over him. The breathing was steady, controlled. Whatever stood there was not winded from the chase. Brian's breathing stopped as if he was holding his breath, trying to be completely still. The other breathing continued, a sniffing sound, like an animal investigating something. Long inhalations, processing scent. This continued for nearly 20 seconds. Each second must have felt like an eternity for Brian, lying there wounded with something massive standing over him. A low sound, almost a grunt, came from whatever was standing above Brian. The tone was neither aggressive nor curious. It sounded almost satisfied, confirmatory. Then the heavy footsteps again, moving away. Each step clearly audible. They grew fainter but did not hurry. The creature was walking, not running. The footsteps stopped somewhere in the distance, still close enough to hear, perhaps 40 feet away. Brian's breathing resumed, sharp and quick, hyperventilating. He did not move. The audio captured him lying there for another minute, maybe longer. His breathing slowly steadied, though it remained fast. Finally, movement, fabric rustling, the sound of him sitting up, a groan of pain, his voice barely a whisper, words unclear. Could have been prayer, could have been nothing. The camera came back up, pointing ahead. The footage showed the trail, empty now. Brian panned right, then left. Nothing visible. He struggled to his feet, the camera shaking violently. Getting up took nearly 10 seconds. Each movement was agony. His left ankle gave out the first time he tried to stand, and he dropped back to one knee with a gasp. On the second attempt, he made it upright, but could not put full weight on the left leg. He started moving, limping badly. His left leg was not working properly. The ankle was either badly sprained or broken. Each step came with a grunt of pain. The camera pointed down at the trail, showing his boots and the sand passing beneath. Blood dripped from his forehead, leaving dark spots on the sand. He moved perhaps 30 feet, each step slower than the last. Then he stopped. He raised the camera again. The creature stood in the trail ahead. The distance was hard to judge from the footage, but investigators later estimated roughly 60 feet based on known trail features visible in the frame. It faced Brian directly, standing in the center of the trail. The lighting was better here, the canopy thinner. Late afternoon sun filtered through, illuminating the creature clearly. The footage captured details that had been obscured in shadows before. The massive shoulders, the broad chest rising and falling with breath. The arms, so much longer than human proportions, hanging relaxed at its sides. The face, mostly hair-covered, but the eyes visible. Dark eyes, watching. Not black like a bear's eyes, but dark brown, almost human in color. The creature's chest moved with its breathing, slow and steady. It shifted its weight from one foot to the other, a subtle movement, but distinctly visible. It did not advance. It simply stood there, blocking the trail, watching Brian with what could only be described as curiosity. Brian took a step backward. His injured leg nearly buckled, but he caught himself. The creature did not react. Its head remained level, eyes fixed on Brian. Another step back. Brian's breathing was loud on the audio, each breath catching with pain. Still no movement from the creature. It waited. Brian turned and began moving away, faster now despite the limp. His body was running on pure adrenaline, overriding the pain signals. He kept the camera pointed behind him. The creature remained where it stood, watching him retreat. Its posture was relaxed, non-threatening. It made no move to follow. Brian covered roughly 40 feet, each step visible in the shaky footage. He fell once, going down hard on his right knee. The camera caught the impact, then sky as he nearly dropped the phone. He recovered, got back up, kept moving. When he glanced back once more, the creature was gone. The trail stood empty. No movement in the vegetation, no sound. It had simply disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. The remainder of the footage showed Brian's painful journey back to the trailhead. He fell twice more, the camera capturing the ground, then sky, then the trail again as he recovered. He never stopped checking behind him. The forest remained quiet, no signs of pursuit. At 2:49 p.m., he reached the parking area. His vehicle was the only one there. The footage showed him fumbling with his keys, dropping them once before getting the door open. The recording ended as he collapsed into the driver's seat. Brian drove directly to Advent Health Waterman in Tavares, 35 miles from the forest. Medical records show he arrived at 3:27 p.m. with lacerations to his scalp requiring 12 stitches, a dislocated left shoulder, severe bruising across his back and left side, and a sprained left ankle. The attending physician documented Brian's account of being attacked by an unknown animal while hiking. Brian turned over his phone to Tavares Police Department that evening. The footage, totaling 31 minutes and 47 seconds, underwent analysis by 3 separate wildlife experts. All confirmed the subject in the video was not a bear, not a person in a costume, and not any known animal in Florida. The proportions, movement patterns, and physical characteristics did not match any documented species. Frame-by-frame analysis of the clearest shots showed details impossible to fabricate with 2025 consumer technology, including individual hair movement, muscle definition beneath the hair, and micro-expressions in the facial features. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission investigated the location 3 days after the incident. Officers found disturbed vegetation consistent with Brian's account, broken branches at the reported locations, and impressions in soft ground near the trail. One clear track measured 17 inches long and 9 inches across at the widest point. Casting was attempted, but the ground conditions produced only a partial mold. The investigation report concluded that Brian had encountered something in Ocala National Forest, but could not determine what species. Brian Phillips recovered from his physical injuries within 8 weeks. He has refused all media requests and will not disclose the exact trail location beyond the general area of Farlow's Prairie. In his single statement to investigators, he described the moment the creature stood over him as the most terrifying experience of his life, not because of what it did, but because of what it chose not to do. The footage remains the clearest, most detailed Bigfoot evidence ever captured in Florida, and the only documented case of physical contact with injuries requiring medical treatment. On October 13, 2023, Emma Rodriguez had been in the Olympic National Forest for only 3 hours when she first heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. The low, resonant call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and echoing from the trees themselves. She froze on the trail, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, too deep and too complex to be produced by any known animal, yet carrying an unmistakable intelligence that suggested communication rather than simple vocalization. The forest around her had fallen completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in terror of what had just announced its presence. Emma's camera equipment began malfunctioning the moment she tried to record the strange vocalizations, her devices shutting down at seemingly random intervals, despite having functioned perfectly just minutes before. Her GPS readings showed impossible coordinates that placed her in locations that didn't exist on any map, while her compass spun wildly as if something was actively interfering with her technology. The silence that followed the creature's call was so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her trembling feet. But beneath that silence, Emma began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. When Emma finally worked up the courage to continue down the trail, she discovered massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, prints that measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. The tracks formed a deliberate pattern around the area where she'd been standing, as if something had been circling her position while she remained frozen in terror. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever had made these prints had approached to within mere feet of where she stood, close enough to touch her. Yet she had never seen or heard its approach through the dense undergrowth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed over 600 pounds, moving with a grace that defied its massive size. Emma's attempts to leave the area were immediately frustrated by obstacles that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Fallen trees blocked the trail she'd used to enter the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. Her satellite phone produced only static and interference that seemed to intensify whenever she tried to call for help, as if something was actively jamming her communications to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with the outside world. The isolation that had seemed appealing when she'd planned this expedition now felt like a trap, with Emma beginning to realize that she was no longer the observer in this situation, but rather the observed. Every step she took seemed to be anticipated, every route she chose blocked by obstacles that appeared too convenient to be natural. The first direct sighting came as Emma struggled to find an alternate route through the dense forest, her panic growing with each blocked path and dead end. Through the trees ahead, she caught a glimpse of something enormous moving between the massive trunks with impossible stealth, a figure that stood upright like a human but possessed proportions that suggested a creature of incredible size and strength. The being seemed to be studying her from a distance, its movements coordinated and purposeful as it paralleled her desperate attempts to escape. When Emma tried to focus her camera on the creature, the device immediately shut down, leaving her with only the terrifying memory of eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with unmistakable intelligence, and what appeared to be curiosity about her presence in its domain. Emma's terror escalated when she realized that the creature was not alone. Sounds of movement from multiple directions indicated that she was surrounded by several large beings that were coordinating their activities with a precision that suggested advanced communication abilities. The forest itself seemed to be working against her escape, with branches that caught at her clothing in ways that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and roots that appeared to shift position to trip her at crucial moments. Her attempts to document what was happening were frustrated by equipment failures that occurred at the most crucial moments, as if whatever was watching her understood the importance of preventing her from gathering evidence of their existence. The creatures seemed to possess an understanding of human technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Emma's frantic escape became a blur of terror as the forest closed in around her. The deeper she ran, the more the landscape twisted. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and something musky. Every time she paused, she could hear the creatures moving just out of sight, their footfalls muffled, guttural calls echoing like a language meant for the trees. At one point, Emma tumbled down a slope into a shallow creek. The water was icy, shocking her back to her senses. She scrambled up, only to see a massive shadow pass silently along the ridge above. The creature paused, its silhouette framed by moonlight, and Emma felt its gaze settle on her like a physical weight. She pressed herself against the bank, barely daring to breathe, as the being let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The chase resumed, but now the creatures were driving her, not just following, but steering her with uncanny precision. Whenever she tried to double back or hide, a branch would snap or a stone would be thrown, forcing her to change direction. She caught glimpses of more than one figure moving in parallel, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements impossibly fast and coordinated. Emma realized with dread that she was being herded toward a destination she could neither see nor understand. Suddenly, the forest opened into a wide, unnatural clearing. The ground was covered in spirals of stones and bones, and the trees around the perimeter were marked with deep gouges and strange symbols. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma felt as if she had stepped into the center of some ancient ritual. The largest creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, its breath steaming in the cold night air. It raised its arms and let out a series of calls, each one answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground tremble. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A test? The creatures circled the clearing, their eyes never leaving her, their movements deliberate and measured. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the circle of stones and the silent, watching eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The creatures melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone and trembling in the center of the clearing. She didn't wait to see if they would return. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Emma fled into the darkness. The memory of the ritual burned into her mind. Even as she ran, she knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only a glimpse of a mystery that would never let her go. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to manifest in ways that Emma struggled to understand or control. She found herself anticipating the movements of her unseen watchers, adjusting her path to avoid areas where she sensed their presence, while simultaneously being herded along routes that led deeper into their territory. The creatures seemed to be learning from their observations of her behavior, adapting their tactics based on her responses, and becoming more sophisticated in their approach with each passing hour. Emma began to feel like a laboratory animal being studied by researchers whose intelligence far exceeded her own, trapped in an experiment whose purpose she couldn't begin to understand. The realization that she was being manipulated by something that could think and plan was more terrifying than simple predation. The most direct encounter came when Emma stumbled into a small clearing and found herself face to face with the massive creature that had been stalking her through the forest. The being stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality in the filtered sunlight, with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. It studied her with the same intensity that she had been trying to use to study the forest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was and what her intentions might be. The moment of eye contact lasted only seconds, but it left Emma with the chilling realization that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't comprehend. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, as if it was encountering something as unusual to it as it was to her. Emma's attempt to slowly back away from the creature was met with a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning, as if the being was trying to communicate something important or warn her about something she couldn't see. The sound was complex, with tonal variations that suggested it was part of a sophisticated language system, and Emma had the disturbing realization that the creature was actually trying to talk to her. When she continued to retreat, the creature's vocalizations became more insistent, and she could hear answering calls from the forest around her as other beings responded to what sounded like tactical coordination. The realization that she was surrounded by multiple intelligent creatures that were discussing her fate in a language she couldn't understand filled Emma with a terror that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The decision to run came when Emma heard the creatures beginning to move closer, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush with increasing boldness as they closed the distance between themselves and their subject. She turned and sprinted toward what she hoped was the direction of the main trail, her flight through the dark forest becoming a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The creature's response was immediate and coordinated, with sounds of movement that indicated they were not willing to let their subject escape without a significant effort to recapture her. Their pursuit began with what sounded almost like disappointment, as if they had hoped for a different outcome from their attempted communication. The chase through the forest revealed the true extent of the creature's physical capabilities as they moved through the dense woodland with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Emma could hear them crashing through the trees behind her, their pursuit coordinated in ways that suggested they were working together to cut off her escape routes and funnel her toward a destination of their choosing. The sounds of their movement indicated that they were not simply chasing her, but were actively herding her, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to guide her flight along paths that would eventually lead her back into their control. Their footsteps thundered through the forest with a rhythm that suggested they were matching each other's pace, working as a coordinated unit rather than individual predators. During her desperate flight, Emma began to notice that the very forest seemed to be conspiring with her pursuers, creating obstacles that slowed her progress while providing clear pathways for the creatures that hunted her through the darkness. Branches caught at her clothing with deliberate precision. Roots shifted to trip her at crucial moments, and the terrain itself seemed to funnel her toward areas where her pursuers could more easily corner her. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the sounds of pursuit were becoming more organized and strategic, with different voices calling to each other in what sounded like tactical coordination. The creatures were communicating constantly during the chase, sharing information about her location and coordinating their movements with military precision. As Emma stumbled through the undergrowth, her panic-stricken mind began to process details that her terror had initially obscured, fragments of understanding that painted an even more disturbing picture of her situation. The creatures pursuing her seemed to be using tools. She could hear the distinctive sounds of implements striking wood and stone, suggesting they possessed technology that no wild animal should have been able to create or use. Their vocalizations carried nuances that indicated not just communication, but complex language, with tonal variations that suggested they were discussing strategy and coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that rivaled human military operations. The realization that she was being hunted by something that could think, plan, and use tools was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. The forest around Emma began to take on an increasingly surreal quality as her flight continued, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source and sounds that seemed to come from directions that defied the laws of physics. She found herself running through areas that her rational mind insisted couldn't exist. Clearings that were perfectly circular despite being surrounded by ancient trees, streams that flowed uphill, and rock formations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The pursuit behind her continued relentlessly, accompanied by phenomena that suggested the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The creatures seemed to possess abilities that went beyond simple physical prowess, as if they could influence the environment itself to aid in their hunt. Emma's terror reached new heights when she realized that her pursuers seemed to be enjoying the chase, their calls carrying what could only be described as amusement, as if her panic was providing them with entertainment rather than simply serving a practical purpose. The creatures appeared to be toying with her, allowing her to think she was escaping only to cut off her route and force her to change direction. Their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them an overwhelming advantage, and Emma began to understand that her flight was nothing more than another part of their experiment, a test of her responses under extreme stress rather than a genuine opportunity for freedom. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as their physical pursuit, designed to break down her resistance and force her into complete submission. At one point during the chase, Emma managed to climb a massive fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across a deep ravine, hoping to put some distance between herself and her pursuers. But as she reached the middle of the makeshift bridge, she heard the unmistakable sound of the creatures climbing up behind her with impossible agility. Their massive hands gripped the bark with ease, their powerful limbs propelling them up the trunk with a speed that defied their enormous size. Emma could hear their breathing growing closer, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of massive bellows. And she realized with growing horror that they were actually gaining on her, despite her head start. The creature's pursuit took on an almost playful quality, as they began to demonstrate abilities that seemed designed to showcase their superiority over their human prey. Emma watched in terror as one of the beings leaped from tree to tree with impossible grace, covering distances that should have been fatal for any creature of its size. Another seemed to be moving through the forest canopy above her, keeping pace with her desperate flight while remaining almost completely invisible among the dense foliage. The coordination between the creatures was so precise that Emma began to suspect they were communicating through methods she couldn't detect, perhaps using infrasonic frequencies or other signals that were beyond human perception. As Emma's energy waned, she stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize, one that seemed impossibly ancient, the ground covered in spirals of stones and bones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something musky, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was only a memory. The creatures paused at the edge, watching her with a patience that felt almost ritualistic. For a moment, Emma felt as if she were the centerpiece of a ceremony, the subject of a gathering that had been waiting for her arrival for centuries. The largest of the beings stepped forward, raising its arms and letting out a guttural call that echoed through the trees, answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The creatures turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone in the clearing. She didn't know if she had passed some kind of test or if they had simply lost interest, but she seized the opportunity to run. Branches whipped at her face and roots threatened to trip her with every step, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear that drowned out all rational thought. Behind her, she could still hear the creatures moving, their calls growing fainter as she put distance between them. But even as she escaped, Emma knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The breakthrough that would save Emma's life came when she stumbled into an area where her cell phone unexpectedly picked up a weak signal, allowing her to place a frantic call to emergency services while still running from her pursuers. The 911 recording captured her panicked description of being chased by creatures that defied rational explanation, beings that moved through the forest with intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive abilities. Her call was interrupted by sounds that the emergency operator later described as unlike anything in their experience. Vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources and carried an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose. The creatures seemed to realize what she was doing and began calling to each other with increased urgency, as if debating whether to stop her communication or allow it to continue. Emma's call ended abruptly when her phone lost signal, but not before emergency responders had obtained her GPS coordinates and a recording that would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The creatures pursuing her seemed to realize that outside help was coming, and their vocalizations took on a different quality, less playful and more urgent, as if they were debating whether to continue their pursuit or retreat deeper into the forest. Emma could hear them calling to each other in what sounded like rapid consultation, their massive forms still crashing through the trees behind her, but with less coordination than before. The change in their behavior suggested that they understood the implications of human authorities becoming involved in their activities. The sound of approaching helicopters seemed to trigger a fundamental change in the creatures' behavior, their pursuit becoming less aggressive as they apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Emma could still hear them moving through the forest around her, but they were no longer actively hurting her or trying to cut off her escape routes. Instead, they seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, their vocalizations fading as they put distance between themselves and the approaching rescue operation. Emma's relief was tempered by the realization that her ordeal was far from over. She was still lost in a vast wilderness with creatures that could return at any moment if they decided the threat had passed. The creatures' withdrawal was not immediate or complete, as Emma continued to hear them moving through the forest around her for several more hours. They seemed to be maintaining surveillance of her position while staying far enough away to avoid detection by the search teams. Their vocalizations became more subdued but never stopped entirely, suggesting that they were continuing to communicate about her presence and the arrival of outside help. Emma had the disturbing realization that she was still being watched and evaluated, even as rescue teams worked to locate her position. The creature's ability to remain hidden while maintaining awareness of the situation demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was deeply unsettling. As the search helicopters grew closer, Emma began to notice changes in the forest around her that suggested the creatures were actively working to conceal evidence of their presence. Footprints that had been clearly visible just hours before seemed to be disappearing, as if someone was deliberately obscuring the tracks. Equipment that had been scattered during her flight was being moved or hidden, and the paths through the forest that had seemed so clear during the chase were becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The creatures appeared to be conducting a systematic cleanup operation, removing any evidence that might confirm Emma's incredible story about what had happened in the wilderness. The search and rescue operation that followed Emma's emergency call revealed evidence that supported her incredible claims while raising new questions about what had actually occurred in those remote mountains. Rangers found massive footprints throughout the area where Emma had been chased, tracks that formed complex patterns suggesting coordinated movement by multiple large beings. Her camera equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dropping, with memory cards that contained hours of footage showing glimpses of enormous figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence and purpose. The equipment had been handled with care, as if the creatures understood its value and had deliberately preserved it for discovery. The footage recovered from Emma's cameras provided the most compelling evidence ever captured of intelligent non-human life in North American forests, showing clear images of bipedal creatures that stood over 8 feet tall and moved with coordination that indicated advanced cognitive abilities. The beings appeared to be deliberately positioning themselves to be recorded, as if they wanted their existence to be documented, but only under circumstances of their own choosing. Most remarkably, some sequences showed the creatures using what appeared to be primitive tools and communicating with each other through complex vocalizations that suggested a sophisticated language system. The footage also captured moments where the creatures seemed to be studying Emma's equipment with obvious scientific interest, manipulating her devices with a dexterity that suggested hands capable of fine motor control. Analysis of the recovered footage revealed details that investigators found deeply unsettling, particularly the way the creatures seemed to be conducting their own documentation of Emma's behavior and responses. Several sequences showed the beings using what appeared to be primitive recording devices of their own, crude but functional tools that suggested they were gathering their own evidence of the encounter for purposes that remained completely mysterious. The creatures' behavior indicated not just intelligence, but also scientific curiosity, as if they were conducting their own research project with Emma as the unwilling subject. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the footage had been edited or altered in ways that suggested the creatures possessed technical knowledge that exceeded what should have been possible for beings living in the wilderness. Emma was found 12 hours after her emergency call, discovered by search teams following the trail of broken vegetation and scattered equipment that marked her desperate flight through the forest. She was dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, though her mental state suggested she had experienced trauma that went far beyond simple fear of wild animals. Her account of being chased by multiple intelligent creatures was initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence and recorded footage forced investigators to take her claims seriously. Most puzzling was her insistence that the creatures had deliberately allowed her to escape once they realized that outside help was coming, suggesting that their intelligence extended to understanding the broader implications of their actions. The evidence left behind after Emma's escape, strange tool marks, massive coordinated footprints, and her haunting footage, forced even the most skeptical rangers to admit she had encountered something far beyond a wild animal. The area was quietly restricted, and rumors spread of a hidden society in the forest. But Emma's story remained the only first-hand account. Her experience stands as a chilling warning. Some mysteries in the wild are not meant to be solved, and the silence of the forest may be watching, waiting for the next intruder. In November 2020, veteran hunter Thaddeus Ravenclaw was tracking elk in the remote Blackmore Mountains when he witnessed something that revealed the horrifying truth about decades of missing hunters in the region. On his third day hunting, approximately 8 miles from base camp, Thaddeus noticed the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Against his better judgment, Thaddeus investigated, positioning himself behind a fallen log on a ridge overlooking a small valley. Through his rifle scope, Thaddeus saw another hunter moving through the forest below. Everything appeared normal, but Thaddeus could see what the hunter couldn't: something massive stalking him from the tree line. The creature moved with fluid grace between the shadows, standing at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they filled spaces between trees. It demonstrated predatory precision that spoke to years of experience hunting human prey, matching the hunter's pace exactly, studying patterns, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The stalking was methodical and calculated. The creature matched the hunter's pace exactly, maintaining consistent distance. When the hunter paused, it paused. When he changed direction, it adjusted accordingly. This wasn't animal behavior. This was calculated predation by an intelligence that understood human psychology and behavior patterns with terrifying sophistication. The creature studied its prey with the patience of a master predator, learning patterns and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. It moved ahead of the hunter, positioning itself to observe from multiple angles. It wasn't just following, it was herding, subtly influencing the hunter's path towards some predetermined kill zone where the attack would be most effective. Most disturbing was the creature's obvious tactical intelligence. It considered wind direction, terrain advantages, escape routes, and optimal attack positions with military-level strategic planning. This suggested extensive practice on human subjects, refining its methods through systematic predation conducted over many years of hunting human beings in these remote mountains. The creature's size alone was terrifying. Through his scope, Thaddeus could see that it stood at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the spaces between trees. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past its knees and ending in hands that appeared capable of crushing human bones like twigs. The creature's entire physiology seemed designed for violence, every aspect of its anatomy optimized for the systematic destruction of human life. At 2:15 p.m., the attack began. The hunter had stopped in a clearing to examine tracks when the creature emerged from the tree line with explosive speed that defied its massive size. Thaddeus got his first clear view of the attacker, a bipedal nightmare covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature's face was a horrifying amalgamation of human and beast, with features that suggested intelligence but were twisted by malevolence and an insatiable hunger for violence. Its eyes burned with an awareness that was unmistakably conscious, calculating, and utterly without mercy. The intelligence behind those eyes was ancient and malevolent, focused entirely on causing maximum suffering to its human prey. The creature's mouth was filled with teeth that were designed not just for killing, but for the systematic dismantling of its victims while they were still alive. The teeth were arranged in rows like a shark's, but they were larger and more varied in shape, suggesting different functions for different types of tissue destruction. Some were designed for cutting, others for grinding, and still others for the precise extraction of specific anatomical components. The hunter had no time to react. The creature struck with tremendous force, sending him flying across the clearing like a child's toy. The impact was so violent that Thaddeus could hear the sound of breaking bones even from his position 300 yards away. The hunter's rifle was torn from his hands and thrown deep into the forest, leaving him completely defenseless against his attacker. Thaddeus found himself frozen in absolute terror. His body refused to respond to his mind's desperate commands to move, to run, to do anything. He could only watch in paralyzed horror as the nightmare unfolded before him. His hunting instincts, honed by decades of experience, screamed at him to flee, but his muscles had turned to stone, leaving him trapped in his own body as a helpless witness to unspeakable horror. The creature didn't kill immediately. Instead, it began systematic assault that demonstrated both intelligence and sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. The creature grabbed the hunter by his legs and began swinging him against nearby trees, using the man's body as a weapon against the forest itself. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The sounds that emerged from the clearing were unlike anything Thaddeus had ever heard. The hunter's screams were not just expressions of pain, they were sounds of absolute terror, the vocalizations of someone who had realized that death would not come quickly or mercifully. The screams echoed across the valley, creating haunting sounds that seemed to energize the creature and drive it to greater heights of violence. Thaddeus watched, unable to move, unable to look away, as the creature's face showed obvious pleasure at the sounds of breaking bones and agonized screams. It would pause between impacts, tilting its massive head as if listening to the hunter's screams with the appreciation of a connoisseur. The creature seemed to be savoring the sounds of suffering, taking time to appreciate the fear in its victim's eyes before continuing the systematic destruction of his body. The systematic nature was most disturbing. The creature wasn't acting on instinct or hunger. It was deliberately prolonging suffering, taking obvious pleasure in terror and pain. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. This was not random violence. It was systematic torture conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing. After several minutes of this brutal assault, the creature changed tactics. It threw the hunter to the ground and began systematically breaking bones with its massive hands, starting with the man's fingers and working its way up his arms. The creature's movements were deliberate and methodical, suggesting extensive experience with this type of torture. Thaddeus's hands shook violently as he tried to process what he was witnessing, but his body remained frozen in place. The creature's hands were perfectly adapted for this work. Its fingers ended in claws that were sharp enough to pierce flesh, but controlled enough to avoid causing immediate death. The creature demonstrated surgical precision in its torture, breaking bones in specific sequences that would maximize pain while preventing shock or unconsciousness. The creature's hands were perfectly designed for systematic torture. Each finger was tipped with a claw that could be used with surgical precision, capable of making cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature's grip strength was tremendous, allowing it to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to break bones without crushing them completely. The hunter's screams grew weaker as shock and blood loss began to take their toll, but the creature seemed to understand exactly how to keep its victim conscious and aware of what was happening. It would pause periodically, allowing the hunter to recover slightly before continuing its systematic destruction of his body. During these pauses, the creature would examine its work with obvious satisfaction, flexing the broken limbs and testing the damage it had caused. The creature took particular pleasure in the unnatural angles at which the bones now bent. It would manipulate the broken limbs, creating new configurations of damage and studying the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. The creature was not just torturing its victim, it was conducting experiments, learning about human anatomy and pain tolerance through direct observation and systematic experimentation. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed horror as the creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical professional, but was terrifying in a predator. The creature knew exactly which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of anatomical expertise was disturbing in its implications. The torture continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 to 40 minutes. The creature had developed specific techniques for different types of torture, breaking bones in particular sequences, positioning the victim to maximize both pain and consciousness duration. The level of refinement suggested years of practice on human subjects, perfecting methods through extensive experimentation. The creature's methods were varied and sophisticated. It would twist limbs until joints dislocated, apply pressure to nerve centers to create waves of agony, and use its claws to make precise cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that suggested it had been studying human physiology through direct experimentation for many years. Throughout this prolonged torture, Thaddeus remained frozen in his hiding spot, his mind screaming at his body to move, to help, to do something, but his muscles refused to respond. He was trapped in his own paralyzed body, forced to witness every horrific detail of the systematic destruction taking place below. His rifle lay useless in his hands, too far away to be effective even if he could overcome his paralysis. The creature seemed to understand exactly how much damage it could inflict without causing immediate death. It knew which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of expertise was terrifying in its implications, suggesting that this creature had been perfecting its torture methods through extensive practice on human victims. The creature began experimenting with different torture methods, testing the hunter's responses to various types of trauma. It would apply pressure to specific points on the body, watching with clinical interest as the victim's reactions provided data about human pain thresholds and anatomical vulnerabilities. The systematic nature of this experimentation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what Thaddeus witnessed. The creature wasn't simply causing pain, it was conducting research, gathering information about human physiology through direct observation and experimentation on a living subject. The creature would create specific types of injuries, then pause to study the effects, taking mental notes about which methods produced the most interesting results. The creature demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond instinctive predation. It understood human anatomy with the precision of a surgeon, knowing exactly which injuries would cause specific types of pain, which damage would be temporary versus permanent, and how to maintain consciousness despite extreme trauma. This level of knowledge could only have been acquired through extensive practice on human subjects. As the torture continued, the creature began to vary its methods, testing different approaches to see which produced the most interesting results. It would break bones in new patterns, apply pressure to different nerve clusters, and create injuries that interacted with each other to produce compound effects. The hunter's body became a canvas for the creature's experimentation. The creature's approach to torture was methodical and scientific, suggesting that it had been refining its techniques through extensive practice on human subjects over many years. Each movement was purposeful, each injury carefully calculated to provide specific information about human physiology and pain tolerance. The creature was building a comprehensive understanding of human suffering through systematic torture. Thaddeus watched in horror as the creature began to focus on specific anatomical systems, testing the limits of human endurance in different areas of the body. It would spend long minutes working on individual limbs, studying the effects of different types of damage with the dedication of a researcher conducting important experiments. The creature's torture techniques were sophisticated and refined, It knew how to break bones in ways that would cause maximum pain, how to dislocate joints to create specific types of agony, and how to use its claws to make cuts that would interact with broken bones to produce compound pain effects. The level of sophistication suggested years of practice and refinement. The creature seemed to take particular interest in the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. It would pause after each new injury to study the victim's face, watching for specific responses that would provide information about the effectiveness of different torture methods. The creature was learning, gathering data that would make it even more effective in future attacks. The systematic nature of the experimentation was terrifying in its implications. The creature wasn't just torturing for pleasure, it was conducting research that would improve its methods and make future attacks even more horrific. Each victim was providing data that would be used to refine the creature's techniques and make subsequent tortures more effective. After an eternity of systematic torture and experimentation, the creature began the final phase of its attack. It grabbed the hunter's head in its massive hands and began applying pressure, slowly crushing the skull while the victim remained alive and aware. The hunter's final screams were cut short as his skull collapsed under the tremendous force applied by the creature's powerful hands. The skull-crushing sound was audible even at Thaddeus's distance, a wet, grinding noise that spoke of tremendous pressure being applied to bone and brain tissue. The creature held the crushed skull for several moments, seeming to savor the moment of death before finally releasing its grip. The creature's face showed an expression of satisfaction and completion, as if it had achieved some important goal. But the horror wasn't over. The creature began a grotesque post-mortem ritual that revealed the true fate of all the missing hunters. The creature systematically dismantled the body, breaking bones and tearing flesh with methodical precision. It consumed some parts immediately, gnawing on bones to extract marrow while the blood was still fresh, creating sounds that echoed across the valley. The feeding behavior was not random or instinctive. The creature selected specific parts of the body, consuming them in a particular order that suggested ritual significance. It would pause between feeding to examine the remaining corpse, as if planning the next phase of its consumption according to some predetermined protocol that had been developed through years of practice. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed revulsion as the creature demonstrated anatomical knowledge that went far beyond simple predation. It knew which organs to consume first, which bones contained the most marrow, which parts of the body would provide the most nutritional value. The creature's feeding was efficient and systematic, suggesting that it had developed these techniques through extensive practice on human victims. The creature's feeding was accompanied by sounds that Thaddeus would never forget: the crack of bones being broken, the wet tearing of flesh, and a low rumbling that might have been the creature's expression of satisfaction. The sounds carried across the valley, creating an audio landscape that belonged in the deepest circles of hell rather than any earthly forest. The most disturbing aspect of this post-mortem ritual was the creature's obvious pleasure in its work. It would pause periodically to examine its handiwork, seeming to take satisfaction in the destruction it had caused. This wasn't simple feeding behavior. It was a celebration of violence conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing and took pride in its achievements. The creature gathered the remaining bones and body parts, loading them into a crude sack made from animal hide. The creature was collecting trophies, taking parts of its victim back to some unknown location where they would join the remains of all the other missing hunters. The sack itself was disturbing in its implications, clearly handmade and stitched together with what appeared to be sinew or dried intestines. The creature had crafted tools for its hunting activities, suggesting a level of intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal behavior. The sack was not the only tool the creature possessed. Thaddeus could see other implements hanging from its belt, crude but effective devices that had been designed for specific aspects of hunting and processing human prey. Then came the methodical evidence elimination. The creature systematically eliminated all evidence of what had occurred. It scattered the hunter's gear across a wide area, buried some items, and threw others into dense undergrowth where they would never be found. The creature understood the importance of concealing its activities, suggesting intelligence that went far beyond simple animal cunning. Most disturbing of all was the creature's methodical approach to evidence elimination. It used branches to obscure bloodstains on the ground, moved rocks to cover disturbed earth, and even rearranged vegetation to make the clearing appear undisturbed. The creature understood human search methods and was taking specific steps to ensure that no evidence of its activities would be discovered. The creature's knowledge of human behavior was extensive and terrifying. It knew how search teams operated, what they looked for, and how to eliminate the specific types of evidence that would lead to discovery. This suggested that the creature had been observing human activities for years, learning their methods and developing countermeasures that would allow it to continue its predation without detection. Within 2 hours of the attack, the clearing showed no obvious signs of what had transpired. The creature had removed the body, scattered the evidence, and transformed the scene of brutal murder into what appeared to be an ordinary forest clearing. Any search team that investigated the area would find nothing to indicate what had happened to the missing hunter. As the creature finished its work, it slowly turned and looked directly toward Thaddeus's hiding spot. For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance. The creature's gaze held unmistakable intelligence, aware, calculating, and utterly without mercy. In that moment of eye contact, Thaddeus realized with absolute certainty that the creature had been aware of his presence throughout the entire attack. It had allowed him to witness its work, perhaps even performed for his benefit, demonstrating its methods and capabilities to someone who would carry the knowledge of its existence back to the human world. The creature's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, evaluating him with the same clinical detachment it had shown while torturing its victim. Thaddeus could see the intelligence behind those eyes, making a decision about whether to add him to its collection or allow him to escape with the knowledge of what he had witnessed. That moment of recognition broke Thaddeus's paralysis like a gunshot. Pure, primal terror flooded his system, overriding the shock that had kept him frozen for the past 2 hours. His body finally responded to his mind's desperate commands, and he exploded from his hiding spot in blind panic, crashing through the undergrowth without regard for stealth or safety. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes and skin as he fled in absolute terror. Behind him, he could hear the creature's roar of rage, a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains, and spoke of fury at having its prey escape. The sound was unlike anything in nature, a vocalization that combined animal rage with intelligent frustration. The sound of massive footsteps thundered behind him, each impact seeming to shake the ground beneath his feet. The creature was pursuing him with the same methodical precision it had shown in its attack. But now there was urgency in its movements, anger at being denied another victim for its collection of human trophies. Thaddeus ran with superhuman speed, born of pure terror, crashing through dense forest without regard for the branches that tore at his flesh or the rocks that bruised his feet. He could hear the creature behind him, its breathing like a steam engine, its footsteps getting closer with each passing second. The creature's pursuit was relentless and methodical. As he crashed through a particularly dense thicket, Thaddeus caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run even colder. Through the trees to his left, another massive form was moving parallel to his path. At first, he thought it might be another tree or a large boulder, but as his terror-sharpened vision focused, he realized with absolute horror that it was another creature. This second creature was similar in size and build to his pursuer, but it wasn't participating in the chase. Instead, it was simply watching, moving through the forest with the same fluid grace, but maintaining a consistent distance. The creature's posture suggested casual observation rather than active hunting, as if it were merely a spectator to the deadly game unfolding in the forest. The realization that there were multiple creatures in these mountains hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated predator. This was evidence of a population, a community of these nightmarish beings that had been systematically hunting human beings in the remote wilderness areas. The implications were staggering and terrifying beyond comprehension. The watching creature's behavior suggested a social structure among these beings. It wasn't interfering with the hunt, respecting what appeared to be territorial boundaries or hunting protocols. The creature seemed content to observe, perhaps learning from the techniques being employed by its companion, or simply enjoying the spectacle of human terror and desperation. As Thaddeus continued his desperate flight, he could see the watching creature keeping pace through the trees, its massive form moving with the same silent efficiency that characterized these beings. The creature's eyes were visible even at distance, burning with the same intelligent malevolence that had characterized his pursuer. But there was also something that might have been amusement in its gaze. The presence of the second creature added a new dimension of terror to Thaddeus's flight. Not only was he being hunted by one of these nightmarish beings, but he was also being observed by another, as if his desperate attempt to escape was providing entertainment for these ancient predators. The psychological impact of being watched while fleeing for his life was almost as terrifying as the physical pursuit itself. The watching creature's behavior suggested that these beings had developed complex social behaviors around their predation of human beings. There were apparently rules and protocols governing their hunts, territorial boundaries that were respected, and perhaps even hierarchies that determined which creature had the right to pursue specific prey. The pursuit seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Thaddeus's lungs burned, his legs screamed in agony, but the terror of what was behind him and what was watching from the side drove him forward beyond the limits of human endurance. He could feel both creatures' presence like physical weights, pressing against his consciousness and filling him with the absolute certainty that he was completely outmatched. Just when he thought the pursuing creature would catch him, when he could almost feel those claws tearing into his back, Thaddeus burst through a line of trees and found himself at the edge of a deep, fast-flowing river. The water was dark and cold, rushing between steep banks with a current that spoke of dangerous depths and hidden obstacles. Without hesitation, driven by pure survival instinct and the absolute certainty that the water offered his only chance of escape, Thaddeus launched himself into the churning water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and shocking his system. The current immediately grabbed him, pulling him downstream with tremendous force that threatened to dash him against the rocks. As he struggled to keep his head above water, fighting against the current that threatened to drag him under and drown him, Thaddeus looked back toward the riverbank. Both creatures now stood at the water's edge, their massive forms silhouetted against the darkening sky like primordial nightmares given physical form. The pursuing creature's eyes burned with frustrated rage, but neither creature made any attempt to enter the river. Whether they couldn't swim or simply chose not to pursue him into the water, Thaddeus would never know. But their reluctance to follow gave him hope for the first time since the nightmare began. Both creatures watched him with those calculating eyes as the current carried him downstream, their gazes never wavering even as the distance between them increased. There was something almost respectful in their observation, as if they acknowledged that their prey had earned its escape through courage and quick thinking rather than mere luck. The watching creature seemed to communicate something to the pursuer, though Thaddeus couldn't hear any sounds over the rushing water. The interaction between the two beings suggested a level of communication and social organization that was terrifying in its implications for human safety in these remote wilderness areas. Thaddeus fought against the current, using every ounce of his remaining strength to swim toward the opposite bank. The water was brutally cold, sapping his energy and threatening to drag him under with each passing moment. Several times he went under, swallowing mouthfuls of river water, but somehow he managed to keep fighting against the current that wanted to claim his life. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Thaddeus finally managed to grab hold of a fallen tree branch extending into the water from the opposite bank. Using the last of his strength, he hauled himself out of the river and collapsed on the muddy shore, gasping and shivering uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He lay there for a long time, too exhausted to move, too traumatized to think clearly about what he had witnessed. When he finally gathered the strength to look back across the river, both creatures were gone, vanished into the forest as silently as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence except for the horrific memories burned into Thaddeus's mind. Thaddeus spent the night huddled against a tree, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every sound the forest made around him. When dawn broke, he began walking downstream, following the river toward civilization. He was found 24 hours later by a search and rescue team, hypothermic, dehydrated, and in a state of severe psychological shock. The rescuers found him sitting by the riverbank, staring across the water with vacant eyes, muttering incoherently about multiple creatures in the forest. He was immediately airlifted to the nearest hospital, where doctors treated him for exposure and exhaustion, but the physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological trauma. Thaddeus was no longer the confident, experienced hunter who had entered the mountains 3 days earlier. He had become something else, a broken man haunted by knowledge too terrible to share. His claims about multiple creatures were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exposure and trauma. Dr. Lyra Wen had been conducting routine botanical surveys in the Bluff Creek region in April of 2015, but she wasn't there under ordinary circumstances. For the past 8 months, the Forest Service had quietly asked specialists like her to document unusual environmental disturbances: vegetation crushed in clustered patterns, tree bark stripped in vertical swaths, soil churned as if by large bipedal movement, anomalies found near the last known locations of more than 100 missing hunters. Lyra wasn't a tracker, but her field work often placed her in remote pockets others didn't reach, and her reports had become one of the few consistent data points the investigation still relied on. The first anomaly that day occurred at 2:47, though Lyra said she hadn't recognized it as significant until much later. She had been photographing a fern when she noticed the forest had gone quiet. A stillness that suggested something large was present, something the ecosystem itself reacted to. She decided to relocate to a different survey site, one closer to established trails where human scent markers might provide psychological comfort, even if they offered no real protection. Her goal was simply to get back to ground other researchers had recently passed through, areas where every missing hunter's trail had abruptly ended. That was when she heard the first footfall. Was it just another one of the missing hunters, or something else entirely? It came from behind her, perhaps 40 feet back, a heavy impact that suggested significant mass. Lyra turned immediately, scanning the forest, but saw nothing beyond the usual tangle of ferns, fallen logs, and vertical tree trunks. She waited, listening. If this was connected to the pattern she'd been monitoring, she knew she had already stayed in one place too long. Then another footfall, this time slightly closer and offset to her left. The sound was distinct, not the 4-point gait of a bear or the lighter tread of a deer, but something bipedal, something walking upright with a stride length that suggested a creature far larger than any human. She began walking, not running, maintaining a steady pace toward what she believed was the direction of the nearest marked trail. Her GPS unit showed she was roughly 2 miles from the access road, a distance she could cover in under an hour if she maintained good speed. Behind her, the footfalls continued, matching her pace exactly. When she accelerated, they accelerated. When she slowed to navigate a fallen log, they slowed. The synchronization was too perfect to be coincidental. Her pack contained bear spray, a whistle, and a satellite emergency beacon that could summon search and rescue within hours. But hours might as well be days if something was actively pursuing her. Was she about to meet the same fate as the hunters who vanished before they ever reached their radios? She reached for the bear spray, unclipping it from her belt and holding it ready in her right hand. Behind her, the footfalls continued their measured rhythm. neither closing distance nor falling back. Whatever was following her seemed content to maintain a fixed interval, as if testing her responses or simply observing her movements. She tried to compensate, angling right toward where her mental map suggested the trail should be, but each time she adjusted her trajectory, a sharp crack would erupt from the direction she was heading, the unmistakable sound of a large branch being snapped or a tree being struck with tremendous force. Was this the same behavior that had funneled those missing hunters away from safety before they disappeared without a trace? The message was clear: do not go that way. Lyra felt her analytical mind struggling to process what was happening. Animals did not herd humans. Predators might stalk prey, might follow at a distance waiting for weakness or opportunity, but they did not actively redirect their target's movement with such obvious intentionality. Was she being pushed along the same path the 100 lost hunters had unknowingly followed? She tried breaking left, pushing through a gap in the ferns toward what looked like more open ground. Immediately, a massive shape moved in her peripheral vision, too fast to be clearly seen, but large enough to register as a wall of dark mass shifting between tree trunks. The movement was accompanied by a deep, forceful exhalation, a sound that carried both volume and what Lyra could only describe as irritation. She veered back to her original path, and the presence behind her resumed its measured pursuit. Lyra's walk became a jog, then a run. Professional caution gave way to primal fear as the full implications of her situation crystallized. She was being hunted. The thing behind her wanted her moving, wanted her going deeper, and it possessed both the physical capability and tactical awareness to ensure she had no choice but to comply. The terrain grew rougher. Moss-slick logs appeared with increasing frequency, forcing Lyra to slow her pace or risk a fall that could break an ankle, or worse. Each time she stumbled, the footfalls behind her would pause, waiting with what felt like patience for her to regain her footing. It did not want her injured. It wanted her mobile, conscious, capable of continuing. Why was it so interested in keeping her alive? Through gaps in the canopy, Lyra caught fragmentary glimpses of her pursuer, a massive shoulder covered in dark reddish-brown hair, an arm longer than any human limb swinging with a gait that was distinctly non-human, a head that seemed too large, too robust, mounted on a neck thick with muscle. The glimpses were never complete, never long enough to form a full picture, but each fragment added to a composite image that defied everything Lyra understood about North American fauna. The forest continued to funnel her leftward, always leftward, through corridors that seemed almost deliberately maintained. Lyra noticed that the undergrowth in certain areas had been cleared or trampled, creating pathways that were not quite trails, but were far more navigable than the surrounding terrain. Were these the same hidden pathways the missing hunters had unknowingly walked moments before they vanished? She tried to use her GPS unit to mark her position, but the device showed only scattered satellite coverage beneath the dense canopy. Her last reliable fix had been nearly 20 minutes ago, placing her roughly 3 miles southeast of her vehicle and moving steadily away from any marked trails. The satellite beacon remained her best option for rescue, but activating it would take time. Time to stop, time to deploy the antenna, time to wait for signal acquisition. And stopping, she knew with absolute certainty, was not something her pursuer would allow. A fallen redwood blocked her path, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter and too high to climb over quickly. Lyra veered right, looking for a way around, and immediately heard a sharp grunt from that direction, a sound that was unmistakably vocal, unmistakably intentional. She reversed course, scrambling left around the log's root system, and the pursuit resumed its steady rhythm behind her. The creature was communicating with her, Lyra realized, not through language, but through sound and position, through the careful placement of warnings and the strategic blocking of escape routes. It was teaching her the boundaries of acceptable movement, training her to respond to its cues. Was this how it had controlled the hunters before revealing what became of them? The forest began to slope downward, subtly at first, then more dramatically. Lyra found herself descending into terrain that felt older, less touched by human presence. The trees grew larger here, their trunks massive enough that 3 people linking hands could not encircle them. And still the footfalls continued behind her, relentless and measured, driving her deeper into wilderness that no longer felt like the forest she knew. Lyra's mind raced through scenarios, searching for options that might shift the dynamic in her favor. She could try to hide, but the creature had demonstrated an ability to track her movements with precision that suggested either exceptional vision or some other sensory capability she could not counter. She could try to fight, but the glimpses she had caught of her pursuer's size made that option suicidal. She could activate the emergency beacon and hope that rescue arrived before whatever was hurting her reached its destination. But that assumed her pursuer would allow her to stop long enough to deploy the device. The only option that remained was to keep moving. A creek appeared ahead, perhaps 15 feet wide and running fast with recent rainfall. Lyra splashed through without hesitation, the cold water shocking against her overheated skin. On the far bank, she paused for just a moment, listening. The footfalls had stopped. She turned, scanning the opposite shore, and saw nothing. For 5 seconds, 10, the forest remained silent and still. Was this the same silence the missing hunters heard in their final moments, right before Bigfoot showed them where he was taking them? Then the creature emerged from the tree line. It stood fully upright, easily 9 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad and arms that hung past where its knees would be. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair that appeared reddish-brown in the filtered light. The face was partially obscured by shadow and distance, but Lyra could make out a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and eyes that reflected light with an amber glow. It stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical. For a moment, neither moved. Lyra's hand tightened on the bear spray canister, though she knew the gesture was futile. If this thing decided to cross the creek and take her, no chemical deterrent would stop it. But it did not cross. It simply stood there, allowing her to see it fully for the first time, as if the reveal was intentional, as if it wanted her to understand exactly what was herding her through the forest. Why reveal itself now? And what did it hope she understood? Then it took one step forward, and Lyra ran. The pursuit resumed with renewed intensity, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between hunter and prey. Lyra no longer harbored any illusions about what was following her, no comforting rationalizations about misidentified bears or tricks of light and shadow. She had seen it clearly, had locked eyes with something that should not exist. She ran harder now, driven by pure survival instinct rather than any coherent strategy. The creek crossing had bought her perhaps 30 seconds of distance, but the creature closed that gap with terrifying efficiency. She could hear it moving through the water behind her. Was this the same speed and precision that had overwhelmed the hunters who never made it out? The undergrowth showed signs of regular passage, vegetation trampled into pathways that wound through terrain no human trail crew would ever mark. This was not wilderness in any conventional sense. This was inhabited space, territory claimed and maintained by something that had lived here long enough to reshape the landscape to its needs. The silence that had marked the beginning of her ordeal had deepened into something absolute. No birds called from the canopy. No insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lyra had studied enough ecology to understand what such silence meant. The complete absence of prey species indicated the presence of an apex predator, so dominant that every other creature had learned to flee or hide when it moved through its territory. She was running through a dead zone, a space that other animals refused to enter. Her legs burned, and her breathing had become ragged and desperate. Lyra knew she could not maintain this pace much longer. She tried to use terrain to her advantage, descending into a steep ravine where thick vegetation might obscure her movements and hide from the creature. Could the ravine offer cover, or was it just another trap? The strategy failed immediately. As soon as she dropped below the ridgeline, she heard the creature reposition above her, its movements so swift and sure-footed that it reached a parallel position before she had covered 20 yards. Lyra scrambled up the opposite side of the ravine, her hands tearing at roots and rock for purchase. At the top, she paused for just a moment, gasping for air, and made the mistake of looking back. The creature stood on the opposite ridge, fully visible in a shaft of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. It tilted its head, studying her across the ravine, and Lyra felt a shock of recognition that went beyond fear. This thing was assessing her, measuring her remaining stamina, calculating how much farther it needed to drive her before she reached whatever destination it had in mind. The creature raised one massive arm and pointed, not at her, but past her, deeper into the forest. The gesture was unmistakable, a clear communication of direction and intent. It wanted her to keep moving, wanted her to go where it was pointing. And when Lyra hesitated, frozen by the surreal nature of receiving directions from something that should not exist, the creature took 3 rapid steps forward and released a vocalization that shook loose needles from the trees around her. Was this the same command that had driven the missing hunters deeper before disappearing without a trace? Lyra said that the sound was like nothing she had ever heard, too deep to be human, too structured to be animal, a rolling bellow that carried layers of meaning she could not parse but understood on an instinctive level. It was a command, a warning, and a promise of consequences if she did not comply. Terrified, she turned and ran in the direction it had pointed. The terrain continued to descend, pulling her into valleys that grew progressively narrower and more confined. The creature behind her navigated the same spaces with fluid ease, its bulk somehow compressing or angling to fit through openings that should have been impassable for something its size. She stumbled over a root hidden beneath leaf litter and went down hard, her palms scraping against rock as she tried to break her fall. Pain lanced through her left wrist, and for a moment she thought she might have fractured it. She rolled onto her back, expecting to see the creature looming over her, expecting the pursuit to end in whatever violent conclusion it had been building toward. Has her luck finally run out? But the creature had stopped. It stood 15 feet away, partially obscured by a massive fir trunk, watching her with that same measured attention. Lyra lay there, chest heaving, waiting for it to close the distance and finish whatever it had started. Seconds passed. The creature did not move. It simply watched, its breathing audible but calm, as if waiting for something. Was it judging whether she was strong enough to survive what it intended to show her, just as it had with the hunters? Then Lyra understood. It was giving her time to recover. It had seen her fall, had assessed that she was injured, and had deliberately pulled back to allow her to get up. The realization was somehow more terrifying than if it had attacked. This thing did not want her dead or incapacitated. It wanted her mobile, functional, capable of continuing. Whatever destination it was driving her toward required her to arrive intact. Lyra forced herself to stand, cradling her injured wrist against her chest. The creature watched her rise, then took a single step backward, creating more space. She continued. Her wrist throbbed with every jarring step, but the pain was manageable. Nothing compared to the exhaustion that was rapidly consuming her remaining reserves. She had been running for over 90 minutes through terrain that would have been challenging even at a walking pace. And then the forest began to change again. Was she approaching freedom or the same fate of those hunters? The trees grew more sparse, the undergrowth thinner, as if she was approaching some kind of clearing or open space. The air grew cooler and carried a smell that made Lyra's stomach clench. The sweet, rotten odor of organic decay, concentrated and unmistakable. The creature's vocalizations changed. Instead of the occasional grunt or exhale, it began producing a series of sharp staccato sounds, almost like clicks or pops, but deeper, resonating from somewhere in its massive chest. The rhythm was urgent, insistent, as if it was communicating something important. Behind those sounds, Lyra thought she heard something else. A response, perhaps, from somewhere ahead of her. The possibility that there might be more than one of these things, that she might be running toward others rather than away from a single pursuer, sent fresh adrenaline flooding through her exhausted system. Was she about to stumble into an ambush or a greater revelation? The ground began to slope more dramatically downward, the angle steep enough that Lyra had to slow her pace or risk tumbling forward out of control. Loose soil and leaf litter made every step treacherous, and she found herself half running, half sliding down an incline that seemed to have no bottom. The creature behind her kept pace effortlessly, its footfalls now coming in rapid succession as it descended the slope with the confidence of something that had traveled this exact route countless times before. Lyra tried to stop, tried to dig her heels in and arrest her downward momentum, but the slope was too steep and the ground too unstable. She was committed now, sliding toward whatever lay at the bottom, whether she wanted to or not. The creature seemed to sense her resistance and released another of those deep, commanding vocalizations. But this time the sound carried a different quality. Not warning or threat, but something that almost sounded like urgency, as if it needed her to reach the bottom quickly, as if time was suddenly a factor in whatever plan it had been executing. What could be waiting for her at the bottom that made speed so critical? A boulder came loose from somewhere above her, tumbling down the slope with gathering momentum. Lyra threw herself sideways, barely avoiding the rock as it crashed past her and disappeared into the shadows below. She looked back up the slope and saw the creature standing at the top, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the canopy. It had not thrown the boulder, she was certain of that, but it had used the rock's movement to reinforce its message. Keep going, do not stop, and reach the bottom. The slope became a chute, a natural funnel of mud and decomposing vegetation that offered no handholds and no way to control her descent. Lyra gave up trying to maintain her footing and simply let gravity take her, sliding and tumbling through the muck as the world spun around her in a chaos of earth and shadow. She hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping in a heap of mud and leaf litter. For several seconds, she could not move, could not think beyond the immediate need to breathe. She lay there in the darkness at the bottom of the chute, waiting for her vision to clear, waiting for her lungs to remember how to function. Was this the place where the missing hunters had vanished without a trace? Then her hand sank into something that was not mud. Lyra's fingers had pushed through fabric, old rotted fabric that tore at her touch. Beneath the fabric was something rigid, something that her scientific training immediately identified as bone. She jerked her hand back and scrambled to her feet, her eyes adjusting to the dim light enough to see what surrounded her. Bodies? The ravine floor was covered with them. Dozens of human remains in various stages of decomposition, some reduced to scattered bones and scraps of clothing, others more recent, still recognizable as the people they had been. Hunting gear lay scattered among the remains. Rifles, knives, backpacks, boots. The smell that had been growing stronger during her descent was overwhelming now, a concentrated reek of death that made her gag and stumble backward. Lyra's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was not a natural accumulation of lost hikers or accident victims. The bodies were too numerous, too concentrated in this single location, and the ravine itself was too remote, too difficult to reach by accident. These people had been brought here, deposited in this hidden chasm by something that had hunted them through the forest, the same way it had hunted her. What creature could do this, and why? This was a dumping ground, a killing field, a place where something disposed of the humans it caught in its territory. A sound from above made her look up. The creature was descending into the ravine, moving with careful precision down the steep walls. It reached the bottom and straightened to its full height, towering over her in the confined space. Lyra pressed herself against the ravine wall, her hand fumbling for the bear spray that she had somehow managed to keep clipped to her belt throughout the chase. But the creature did not attack. Instead, it approached her slowly, its movements deliberate and non-threatening. It stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Lyra could see the details of its face, The deep-set eyes, the flat nose, the mouth that seemed too wide, too expressive. It studied her for a long moment, then did something that shattered every assumption Lyra had made about her situation. It reached down, gently, and lifted her. The creature's hands were enormous, easily capable of crushing her ribs or snapping her spine, but they held her with surprising delicacy, as if she were something fragile that required careful handling. It raised her up and set her down among the bodies, positioning her carefully, almost reverently. Then it stepped back and simply watched her, its head tilted in what looked like expectation. Why bring her here, and why reveal the truth behind the missing hunters to her of all people? Lyra stood frozen among the dead. The creature had chased her for miles, had herded her with precision and intelligence, had driven her into this ravine of corpses. But it had not killed her. It had not harmed her beyond the injuries she had sustained during the chase itself. It had brought her here for a reason, had positioned her among the bodies as if she was supposed to see them, supposed to understand something about this place. It wanted her to witness this. But why? The creature continued to watch her, its breathing steady, its posture relaxed. It was waiting for something, expecting some kind of response or reaction that Lyra could not begin to guess. She looked around at the bodies surrounding her, at the decades of victims that had been accumulated in this hidden ravine, and felt a horror that went beyond fear of death. This thing could have been hunting humans for years, perhaps decades, and it had brought her here to show her the results. What kind of mind, human or otherwise, could maintain such a legacy? The remains varied dramatically in age and condition. Some were little more than scattered bones, bleached white by time, and the elements that managed to penetrate into the ravine. Others were more recent, still clothed in modern synthetic fabrics that had resisted decay better than the flesh they covered. She identified at least 3 bodies that could not have been here more than a few months, based on the degree of decomposition and the condition of their gear. The victims were predominantly male, predominantly equipped with hunting rifles and outdoor gear that suggested they had been in the forest deliberately. Why were these hunters specifically targeted, and what did they do to draw its attention? Then she noticed something else that made her skin crawl. Many of the bodies had been arranged, positioned with a care that went beyond simply dumping corpses into a convenient location. Some lay in neat rows, their limbs straightened, and their gear placed beside them in organized piles. The attention to detail suggested ritual or ceremony, behaviors that implied symbolic thinking far beyond what any known animal should possess. The creature watching her shifted its weight, and Lyra's attention snapped back to the immediate threat. It remained at the same distance, making no move to approach or retreat, but something in its posture had changed. Its head was cocked at a slight angle, and its eyes, those disturbingly intelligent eyes, were fixed not on her, but on something beyond her, up toward the rim of the ravine. Lyra followed its gaze, but saw nothing except the steep walls and the tangle of vegetation that obscured the forest above. Then she heard it. A vocalization rolled across the forest canopy, deep and resonant, carrying a tonal quality that was distinctly different from the sounds her pursuer had made. This was lower, more sustained, almost questioning in its cadence. The creature beside her went rigid, every muscle in its massive frame tensing as if preparing for confrontation. It released a soft huffing sound, barely audible, that Lyra's exhausted mind interpreted as distress or concern. Were the creatures responsible for the missing hunters now converging on the ravine? Another call answered from a different direction, this one sharper and more aggressive, carrying an unmistakable edge of anger or challenge. The creature in the ravine with her began to pace, its movements no longer calm and controlled, but agitated, almost frantic. It glanced between Lyra and the ravine walls as if calculating options, weighing decisions. For the first time since the pursuit had begun, Lyra said she sensed genuine uncertainty in its behavior, as if events were unfolding in ways it had not anticipated or planned for. The creature suddenly moved toward her, and Lyra's hand went to the bear spray in a futile gesture of self-defense. But it did not attack. Instead, it grabbed her, not roughly, but with clear urgency, and lifted her toward a section of the ravine wall where the slope was less vertical, where handholds and footholds might allow someone to climb. It pushed her upward, its enormous hands positioning her feet on ledges and its vocalizations taking on a tone that sounded unmistakably like encouragement or instruction. It was trying to help her escape. The realization hit Lyra with stunning force. This creature had chased her for miles, had herded her into this ravine of corpses, had shown her evidence of decades of killing, and now it was trying to save her from whatever was approaching. The contradiction made no sense. Lyra scrambled upward, her injured wrist screaming with pain as she pulled herself from ledge to ledge. The creature below continued to vocalize, the sounds growing more desperate, more insistent. She was perhaps 15 feet up the ravine wall when the first of the newcomers appeared at the rim above her. The creature above was bigger, much bigger. Where her pursuer stood around 9 feet, this one loomed closer to 11, scarred and almost black, glaring down into the ravine before unleashing a roar that shook loose dirt. A second giant appeared beside it. Lyra froze, 3 of them now, and she was trapped. The smaller one, the one that had chased her, stood between her and the newcomers, vocalizing in sharp, nervous bursts. The 2 giants dropped into the ravine and confronted it, their gestures and harsh sounds aimed at her and the bodies scattered across the floor. Then one stopped, sniffed, and spotted her. Its roar hit her like a physical blow. It swatted the smaller creature aside, and the 2 giants began climbing toward her with slow, confident precision. The smaller creature slammed into them, breaking their climb and sending both crashing across the ravine. She bore witness to the 2 giants turning on the smaller one. Lyra climbed, using their fight as distraction. She was nearly at the rim when one howled. She said that she didn't know what happened, but the ravine shifted as a collapse began behind her. Lyra didn't look back. She dragged herself over the rim and ran. Lyra ran until she hit a near-vertical slope, and with no options left, threw herself down it. She tumbled violently, but survived, battered and half-broken at the bottom. For hours, Lyra limped aimlessly in the forest, without any sign of the creatures. She thought of the smaller creature that had chased her, protected her, and maybe even died for her. Whatever it had intended, it had made a choice no one would ever believe. Lyra left Bluff Creek and never returned. Some things she had learned were meant to stay hidden in the forest. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.